Most people believe collapse looks dramatic. They imagine panic in the streets, markets crashing overnight, headlines screaming the end of everything they know. That is not how it happens. Real collapse is quiet at first. It begins invisibly, and by the time it becomes obvious, escape is no longer an option. Right now, something foundational has already ended, and almost no one is talking about it. If you live in the United States, your paycheck, your savings account, your retirement fund, your cost of living, all of it rests on a single assumption you were never taught to question. That the dollar will always be accepted, that it will always hold value, that the world will always want it. What if that assumption is no longer true? Not in theory, not someday, but now. The most powerful monetary arrangement of the last 50 years has quietly expired. Not suspended, not modified, expired. And with it, the invisible support holding up the American standard of living is beginning to disappear. This is not a political story. It is not a partisan story. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is a historical pattern, one that has repeated for centuries, now reaching its next iteration. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because this story does not begin today. It begins in 1971. In August of that year, the President of the United States went on television and made an announcement that fundamentally altered the nature of money. The country was told it was temporary, necessary, a technical adjustment. What actually happened was far more profound. The dollar was severed from gold. For the first time in modern history, the world's dominant currency was backed by nothing tangible at all, only confidence. That decision created a problem that could not be solved through economics alone. If money is no longer anchored to something real, why should anyone accept it? Why would foreign governments hold it? Why would global trade depend on it? Why would nations trust it with their reserves? The answer arrived 3 years later, not through markets, but through geopolitics. Oil. In the mid-1970s, a quiet agreement reshaped the global system. Energy, the lifeblood of industrial civilization, would be priced exclusively in US dollars. If a country wanted oil, it needed dollars first. This single condition created artificial global demand for American currency on a scale never seen before. Japan needed dollars. Germany needed dollars. China needed dollars. Everyone needed dollars. And because everyone needed dollars, the United States gained an unprecedented privilege. It could print money without immediate consequences. It could run deficits without restraint. It could import goods while exporting inflation. It could borrow endlessly at low interest rates because the world needed a place to store its dollars. This was not capitalism in the traditional sense. It was monetary gravity. For decades, this system worked so smoothly that most Americans never realized it existed. They saw cheap goods, rising asset prices, expanding consumption. They did not see the mechanism underneath. But no system built on confidence alone lasts forever. Every reserve currency in history follows the same arc. First, dominance. Then overextension, then debt, then debasement, then loss of confidence. The names change. The sequence does not. The Spanish silver real once ruled global trade. Then it collapsed. The Dutch guilder replaced it. Then it collapsed. The British pound became the world's anchor currency. Then it collapsed. Each empire believed its case was different. Each was wrong. What makes the present moment unique is not that the pattern is new. It is that the scale is larger than ever before. The dollar does not support one empire. It supports the entire global financial system. And that system is now shifting. Quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. Over the last 2 decades, the share of global reserves held in dollars has been steadily declining. Not because of ideology, not because of hostility, because of risk management. Foreign governments are not emotional. They are mathematical. They see the debt trajectory. They see the monetary expansion. They see the weaponization of the financial system. And they are adjusting. When confidence erodes, it does not vanish overnight. It diversifies. Trade begins settling in other currencies. Reserves shift toward tangible assets. Exposure is reduced incrementally. From the inside, this looks like nothing. From the outside, it looks like preparation. Most Americans have been taught to believe the dollar's strength comes from productivity and innovation. That belief is comforting and incomplete. The true strength of the dollar has come from forced global demand. Remove that demand, and the math changes. When the world no longer needs to hold dollars, the surplus returns home. That surplus does not disappear. It shows up as inflation, not the kind caused by supply shortages, the kind caused by excess currency. This is why prices rise even when productivity does not, why wages lag, why savings quietly lose purchasing power. Inflation is not an accident. It is the release valve of a system that printed more claims than it could honor. For decades, the pressure was exported. Now it is returning. The danger is not that Americans will wake up to a single catastrophic event. The danger is that they will normalize decline. Higher prices become routine. Lower expectations become accepted. Debt becomes permanent. This is how collapse actually happens. Not through panic, through adjustment. And once a population adjusts to less without understanding why, the system no longer needs to justify itself. This is why no one in power wants to explain what is happening. Because once people understand the mechanism, confidence collapses faster. Better to frame it as temporary, transitory, external. But history is not fooled by language. Reserve currencies do not die because people lose faith suddenly. They die because faith becomes conditional. And once faith is conditional, the end is only a matter of time. We are now inside that window. Not at the beginning, not at the end, in the middle. Where choices still exist, but narrow rapidly. This is the part of the story most people never study, because it is uncomfortable. It forces uncomfortable questions. What is money really? What gives it value? And what happens when belief shifts? To answer those questions, we have to look beyond headlines. We have to look at history, at incentives, at human behavior under monetary stress. And that is where the real story begins. De-dollarization does not begin with defiance. It begins with accounting. Nations do not wake up one morning and decide to abandon a dominant currency out of ideology or rebellion. They do so because incentives change, because risk changes, because dependence becomes exposure. History is unambiguous on this point. Reserve currencies are not removed. They are outgrown. The first misconception most Americans hold is that the dollar's role in the world is protected by goodwill, admiration, or moral leadership. It is not. It is protected by utility. And utility is always conditional. When a currency ceases to serve the interests of those who rely on it, they do not protest. They prepare. Preparation is quiet. Preparation is gradual. Preparation is invisible until it isn't. To understand where we are now, we must examine how reserve currencies have actually lost their status in the past. Not in theory. In practice, the British pound did not collapse in a single moment. It remained dominant long after the British Empire had begun to decline. What ended its reign was not defeat, but debt. 2 world wars forced Britain to finance survival through borrowing. Gold reserves drained. Trade deficits widened. Confidence eroded slowly, then suddenly. By the mid-20th century, the pound was still respected, but no longer trusted as the world's anchor. Trust, once lost, does not return. The same pattern played out earlier with the Dutch guilder. The Netherlands dominated global trade in the 17th century, not because of size or military force, but because of financial sophistication. Amsterdam became the clearinghouse of global commerce. But financial leadership created temptation. Debt increased. Speculation expanded. Military costs rose. Eventually, capital sought safer ground. The guilder did not fail. It was replaced. Even earlier, Spain's silver-based system collapsed not because silver disappeared, but because excess issuance destroyed confidence. Silver flooded Europe faster than real production could absorb it. Prices exploded, debt soared, trust vanished. The lesson is consistent. A reserve currency does not die when it is attacked. It dies when it is overused. Now consider the modern dollar system. Since the 1970s, the United States has run persistent trade deficits. This was not an accident. It was a feature of reserve currency status. The world sent goods. America sent dollars. Those dollars accumulated abroad as reserves. As long as those reserves stayed abroad, inflation remained muted at home. This arrangement allowed Americans to consume more than they produced for decades without immediate consequences. But there is a limit to how many claims the world is willing to hold, especially when those claims are no longer neutral. Over time, the dollar ceased to be merely a medium of exchange. It became a geopolitical instrument. Sanctions, asset freezes, financial exclusions. Each use of monetary power signaled a new risk that holding dollars was no longer politically neutral. For foreign governments, this changed everything. Reserve assets are meant to be safe in all circumstances. Once safety becomes conditional, diversification becomes mandatory. This is not theory. This is documented behavior. Over the past 20 years, bilateral trade agreements have increasingly bypassed the dollar. Energy transactions have begun settling in alternative currencies. Central banks have increased gold reserves. Cross-border payment systems have diversified. None of this appears dramatic in isolation. Together, it signals structural change. The second misconception is that de-dollarization requires a single replacement currency. It does not. History shows that reserve currencies rarely lose dominance to a single successor. They lose dominance to fragmentation. Multiple currencies, multiple settlement systems, multiple stores of value. This fragmentation reduces global dollar demand even without eliminating it. And because the dollar system relies on scale, even modest reductions matter. When global demand weakens, the surplus returns. That surplus manifests domestically as inflation. This is the critical mechanism Americans rarely understand. Inflation is not primarily caused by shortages. It is caused by excess money chasing limited goods. For decades, excess dollars were absorbed abroad. Now they are coming home. This is why inflation appears persistent rather than temporary. Why interest rates rise without restoring affordability. Why asset prices inflate even as real wages stagnate. The system is adjusting, not collapsing. Adjusting, but adjustment has consequences. As borrowing becomes more expensive, the cost of servicing existing debt rises. The United States now carries debt levels that would have been considered catastrophic for any other nation. The difference has always been the dollar. Remove unquestioned demand for dollars, and the math changes. Higher interest rates mean higher debt servicing costs. Higher debt servicing costs crowd out other spending. Eventually, something must give. Historically, governments choose the least visible option. They inflate. Inflation is not a failure of policy. It is a policy. It allows obligations to be reduced in real terms without explicit default. But inflation is a tax, and it is regressive. Those with assets adapt. Those with fixed incomes fall behind. Those with savings lose purchasing power quietly. This creates social tension long before it creates political crisis. History, again, is clear. Late-stage reserve currency systems experience rising inequality, not because elites conspire, but because monetary expansion benefits those closest to asset markets first. This is known, documented, and repeatable. The result is a psychological shift. People feel the system no longer rewards effort. Trust erodes, institutions lose legitimacy. And yet, life goes on. This is what makes the moment dangerous. Collapse does not announce itself, it normalizes. Higher prices become routine. Debt becomes permanent. Expectations shrink. The greatest risk is not panic, it is adaptation to decline. This is the stage where historical momentum accelerates. Because once adjustment becomes socially accepted, correction becomes politically impossible. Every reserve currency that reached this phase believed it could manage the transition indefinitely. None did. The final misconception is that the United States can reverse this process through strength alone. Military power does not create monetary trust. Innovation does not negate debt arithmetic. Narratives do not override incentives. The dollar's dominance was never about virtue. It was about necessity, and necessity is fading. This does not mean the dollar will disappear. It means it will change roles. From unquestioned anchor to negotiated participant. From default to option. That shift alone has profound implications. Living standards adjust. Global influence narrows. Financial volatility increases. This is not a prediction. It is historical precedent. The uncomfortable truth is that reserve currency decline is not a choice, but response is. Some societies deny, some lash out, some adapt. The next phase determines which path is taken, and that phase is not economic. It is psychological. When a reserve currency enters its late stage, the most consequential shifts are not visible on balance sheets. They occur in perception. Systems may still operate. Markets may still trade. Institutions may still speak with authority. Yet something essential begins to erode beneath the surface. What disappears first is not wealth. It is trust. Trust in the future, trust in effort, trust in continuity. History shows that late-stage monetary systems generate a specific psychological environment. It is not panic. It is tension without clarity. People sense that the rules have changed, but no one can clearly explain how. This ambiguity is profoundly destabilizing. In early stages of a currency system, cause and effect feel legible. Work leads to advancement. Saving preserves value. Planning feels meaningful. In late stages, that relationship fractures. People work harder, but move less. They save more, but feel poorer. They follow the rules, yet fall behind those who do not. This is not imagined. It is structural. When money creation outpaces real productivity, rewards flow toward those closest to capital and away from those dependent on wages. This dynamic has appeared in every late-stage reserve currency system in recorded history. The Roman denarius, the Spanish silver real, the British pound, and now the dollar. For the average American, this does not feel like monetary theory. It feels like unfairness. Housing becomes unreachable relative to income. Education transforms from opportunity into lifelong debt. Healthcare becomes a financial liability rather than a service. None of this registers as collapse. It registers as friction. And friction, sustained over time, reshapes behavior. People become defensive. They hoard rather than invest. They consume narratives that promise restoration rather than adaptation. The Stoic philosophers described this psychological state with unsettling accuracy centuries ago. They warned that when external systems become unreliable, individuals seek certainty wherever it appears most immediate. If reason cannot provide it, emotion will. This is why late-stage societies experience polarization, not because people become irrational, but because complexity overwhelms comprehension. The modern monetary system is extraordinarily abstract. Most citizens cannot observe its mechanics directly. They experience only outcomes: rising prices, stagnant wages, growing insecurity. Without structural understanding, people personalize systemic effects. Blame replaces diagnosis. This is the breeding ground of cultural fragmentation. Groups form around identity rather than analysis. Certainty replaces curiosity. Moral outrage substitutes for economic literacy. This is not a moral failure. It is a cognitive response to opacity. When systems become too complex to interpret, the human mind simplifies out of necessity. At the same time, elites undergo their own transformation. In early stages of dominance, elites invest in expansion. They build, they innovate, they take risk. In late stages, the incentive structure reverses. Preservation becomes paramount. Capital seeks insulation rather than growth. Influence replaces production. Access becomes more valuable than contribution. This is not conspiracy. It is rational behavior within a declining risk environment. When returns diminish and volatility increases, those closest to power prioritize protection. Assets are diversified globally. Residencies become optional. Exposure is reduced. The problem is not that elites adapt. The problem is that they adapt asymmetrically. As elites insulate themselves, the sense of shared exposure disappears. Losses feel socialized. Gains feel privatized. This perception, whether fully accurate or not, is devastating to legitimacy. The Stoics emphasized that authority cannot survive without the appearance of fairness. When people believe the system no longer binds all participants equally, compliance becomes transactional. Trust weakens. Cohesion fractures. Institutions persist, but belief thins. This is the paradox of late-stage systems. They are wealthier than ever in absolute terms, yet more insecure than ever psychologically. Abundance coexists with anxiety. The American experience today reflects this paradox perfectly. Material comfort remains historically high, yet stress, resentment, and uncertainty dominate public discourse. The Stoics would not have been surprised. They argued that insecurity does not arise from scarcity alone, but from unpredictability. When people cannot anticipate outcomes, they lose orientation. Orientation is essential to psychological stability. Without it, individuals oscillate between denial and panic. Some retreat into nostalgia, others into ideology, others into distraction, few into discipline. This is where late-stage cycles become dangerous, not because collapse is imminent, but because misinterpretation becomes widespread. People demand solutions that restore outcomes without addressing causes. They want lower prices without lower debt, higher wages without higher productivity, stability without sacrifice. History shows this is impossible. Late-stage monetary systems cannot be repaired through narrative alone. Adjustment is inevitable. The only variable is how it occurs, violently or gradually, chaotically or deliberately, with dignity or with denial. This is the phase where individual response becomes decisive. Not everyone experiences late-stage decline the same way. History shows that outcomes diverge sharply. Some double down on dependency. They trust institutions they no longer believe in. They wait for restoration that never comes. Others withdraw entirely. They disengage. They become cynical. They lose agency. A third group adapts consciously. This group is rarely visible. They do not dominate headlines. They do not win cultural battles. They focus on fundamentals, skills, flexibility, optionality, resilience. They reduce unnecessary debt. They diversify income. They invest in competence rather than credentials. This group consistently emerges in every historical transition. They are not immune to hardship, but they are less destabilized by it. The Stoics trained precisely for this condition. They taught that freedom does not mean control over circumstances. It means control over response. They distinguished between what lies within one's power and what does not. Monetary systems lie outside individual control. Preparation does not. The late stage of a reserve currency cycle therefore becomes a sorting mechanism between those who demand guarantees and those who build resilience, between those who outsource security and those who internalize it, between those who consume narratives and those who study structures. This sorting determines post-transition outcomes. Those who adapt early suffer less disruption later. Those who resist longest experience the most severe adjustment. This is not punishment, it is consequence. The psychological challenge of this stage is acceptance, not resignation. Acceptance. Acceptance that the system will change. Acceptance that privileges were conditional. Acceptance that continuity requires adaptation. Acceptance does not weaken people, it stabilizes them. Those who accept reality early gain psychological leverage. They plan, they adjust, they remain composed. Those who deny reality exhaust themselves, resisting inevitability. History is merciless on this point. The late stage is not the end. It is the turning, and how societies and individuals behave here determines whether the next chapter is defined by chaos or coherence. There is a moment in every long historical cycle when momentum slows enough to be felt. Not because progress has ended, not because systems have failed overnight, but because continuation is no longer automatic. For decades, Americans lived inside a monetary environment that required little conscious attention. The dollar worked. Prices were stable enough. Credit expanded. The future felt legible. That era is ending. Not with collapse. With recalibration. History does not revoke privilege suddenly. It erodes it gradually until behavior finally adjusts. This is where the United States stands today. Not at the end of its story, at the end of an assumption, the assumption that monetary dominance could substitute indefinitely for discipline, that consumption could outpace production without consequence, that debt could expand faster than income without adjustment. Every reserve currency system reaches this reckoning. None escape it. The question is never whether the system will change. It will. The question is how a society responds when dominance becomes conditional rather than absolute. History shows three broad responses. The first is denial. This response clings to narratives of permanence. It frames every warning as pessimism. It mistakes past success for future immunity. Denial delays adaptation. It does not prevent correction. The second response is anger. This response seeks culprits rather than causes. It personalizes systemic outcomes. It demands restoration without sacrifice. Anger consumes energy without producing leverage. The third response is acceptance. Not surrender, acceptance. Acceptance that the cycle is real. Acceptance that privileges were conditional. Acceptance that preparation matters more than prediction. This response is rare, and it is decisive. Acceptance allows individuals and societies to act early rather than react late. This is where historical outcomes diverge. The decline of a reserve currency does not automatically produce catastrophe. What produces catastrophe is refusing to adapt to the loss of monetary privilege. Britain did not disappear when the pound lost reserve status. The Netherlands did not collapse when the guilder faded. Spain did not vanish when silver failed. What changed was position. Living standards adjusted. Global influence narrowed. Domestic priorities shifted. And eventually, new equilibria emerged. The United States is capable of the same trajectory. But capability is not destiny. Execution requires seriousness. At the national level, seriousness means acknowledging that monetary power cannot replace productive capacity indefinitely. At the institutional level, it means understanding that stability cannot be printed. At the individual level, it means recognizing that guarantees were never permanent and acting accordingly. This is the part rarely discussed, because it places responsibility back where it belongs. Late-stage monetary systems reward those who reduce dependency. Dependency on cheap debt. Dependency on constant appreciation. Dependency on institutions to provide certainty. This does not require isolation. It requires optionality. Optionality of skills. Optionality of income. Optionality of geography. Optionality of thought. Those with optionality absorb shocks. Those without it absorb losses. This pattern appears in every historical transition. The Stoic philosophers understood this long before modern economics. They taught that freedom does not mean control over events. It means control over response. They distinguished between what lies within one's power and what does not. Monetary systems lie outside individual control. Preparation does not. Resilience does not require prediction. It requires orientation toward competence rather than entitlement, toward discipline rather than excess, toward reality rather than narrative. These qualities cannot be inflated away. They cannot be sanctioned. They cannot be confiscated. In a world of monetary transition, they become the most reliable assets of all. The future of the United States will not be determined by whether the dollar remains dominant. It will be determined by whether Americans can recalibrate expectations without losing cohesion, whether they can accept limits without abandoning ambition, whether they can reduce excess without embracing scarcity, whether they can disagree without fragmenting. History offers no guarantees, but it offers guidance. Periods of transition reward clarity. They punish denial. They elevate competence. They expose fragility. Those who cling hardest to the past suffer most. Those who prepare early suffer least. Preparation does not require fear. It requires honesty. Honesty about incentives, honesty about trade-offs, honesty about the cycle. The dollar's story is not ending. It is changing. And change, when understood early, is navigable. If you have followed this reflection to its conclusion, it suggests something important. You are not looking for reassurance. You are looking for understanding. That matters. Because understanding precedes agency. If this analysis sharpened your perspective rather than soothed it, that was intentional. Clarity is not comfort. It is orientation. And orientation is what allows people to move through uncertainty without panic. If you believe this work deserves continuation, not as noise, but as serious inquiry, staying connected helps ensure that depth is not drowned out by spectacle. A measured acknowledgement helps this reach others who value analysis over slogans. And if you choose to share this, do it deliberately, not broadly, but personally. Send it to one person you trust, one person who would actually want to discuss it, one person who values understanding over outrage. If you leave a comment, make it thoughtful. Not agreement, not applause. Reflection. Because meaningful dialogue is the only currency that holds value in uncertain times. This work exists for one reason: not to predict disaster, not to provoke fear, not to assign blame, but to help people remain grounded while systems recalibrate. History will continue. Cycles will unfold. The only remaining question is who will meet this moment consciously and who will be caught arguing with reality as it passes them by.